I'd also like to recognize the traditional peoples who own this land, the Onondaga Nation. That ownership means that the state of New York pays our nation an annual annuity for that privilege, the privilege of being on our land. And that, brothers and sisters, is an expression of sovereignty. What I'm going to do is focus on the international work that Indigenous peoples around the world have been doing for a very long time. And I'm going to start with giving you a very quick story about a Cayuga chief named Discahe. Some of you may know that story, and some of you may not, but I want to share it. Discahe traveled to Geneva, Switzerland in 1923. His idea was to meet with the community of nations, known as at that time as the League of Nations. He traveled to Geneva hoping to talk to them and share with them something that his people had been experiencing, and that was the violation of their treaty with the nation of Canada. Well, Chief Discahe tried for over a year to get an audience with the League of Nations, but there were several members of that league who would not allow that to happen. So he left Geneva, came back to the United States, and thought he had failed. In fact, he died on the Tuscarora Nation because Canada wouldn't allow him back into his territory. So he died there with his friends, thinking that he had failed, but certainly he hadn't. What he had done was created the beginning of a long process of working within the international community. That was his legacy, and a wonderful legacy. Most people did not hear about Chief Discahe until 2001. And why that happened was we had realized at my office, the American Indian Law Alliance, that a circle had been completed. That in 2001, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues was holding its first meeting. Now we were a part of the Economic and Social Council. Now we were a subsidiary organ of the UN. We were no longer in the sub-basement. We had moved to the Upper East Side, so to speak. But we were there. And what we wanted to do was share with our Indigenous brothers and sisters this story. So we put the story together and we sent it out. We didn't think too much of it until the opening ceremony of the Permanent Forum. The Secretary General, Kofi Annan, was at the opening. He spoke, but he spoke after the Tadadaho of the Haudenosaunee, Sid Hill, spoke. Kofi Annan spoke, and the first thing he talked about was Chief Discahe. Well, I didn't fall off my seat, but I almost did. The fact that this story had now reached the Secretary General, the highest position within the United Nations, was just a wonderful thing to experience. That the story had gone out to the international community. Well, what also happened at that time in 2001, I personally believe that it was important to follow protocol, especially when it comes to the regional territory of Indigenous peoples. When you are in someone's territory, you acknowledge those folks, you thank them for allowing you on their sovereign territory, and I felt that that was the least the United Nations should do for the opening of this event. Well, UN officials didn't agree with me. In fact, they gave me a challenging time. They suggested that I document my argument, so I presented this almost legal argument of why the Tadadaho of the Haudenosaunee should open this huge event. Because since 1923 and 1977, the Haudenosaunee have been the leaders and in the forefront of this amazing movement. Well, they acknowledged the error of their ways. They agreed that I was right, and they invited Sid Hill to do that opening. So every year since then, since 2006, our leaders have been invited to do that opening. And this past year, for the first time, someone who spoke Onondaga and could interpret was put in an interpreter's booth, and everybody heard the words before all words, our greetings, in 5 languages. It was spoken in Onondaga and it was translated into the 5 official languages of the UN, which was also kind of amazing to hear it in Arabic and Chinese and French and Spanish, in English and so on and so forth. But I tell you this story because this is an international expression of our sovereignty. The sovereignty of Indigenous nations, because for us, sovereignty is an act. It's not something that is given to you. It is something that you express, that you act out. And the other 2 speakers have said that in their presentation. It's not something you think about and hope somebody will give you. No, it's something you do and you take action in doing. So that the history, of Indigenous peoples going to the international community of nations seeking justice is an old history, starting with Disgaea. Indigenous peoples throughout the world began to realize that what they had been doing, going to the courts, speaking with the politicians of the United States, were not getting us anywhere. That they and we were exhausting all of our remedies. Where was the next forum? And some brilliant leaders, and you've met a lot of them, and they've spoken in this series, decided that that would be the way for us to go. We would now speak to the international community of nations on a nation-to-nation level. And we would talk about things like our land, our territories, our resources. We would talk to them about free, prior, and informed consent, that you cannot do things like dumping your toxic waste in our sacred waters at Onondaga Lake without the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. That we would begin to move in such a way that we would develop a document that would cover all these things that Richard and Scott talked about. Group rights, the right to self-determination, determining where you will be. Just as a human being, you have that right. So this history is nothing new. It's just hasn't gotten out there as yet. This dynamic interface between Indigenous peoples, and there's over 370 million in the world, in 70 different countries and on every single continent. This dynamic interface has produced a number of things. It has produced a new awareness of Indigenous concerns and Indigenous rights, and this series is an example of that, as far as I can see. This dynamic interface has produced a recognition of Indigenous peoples' invaluable contribution to cultural diversity and heritage, especially our traditional knowledge, which demands another discussion in terms of our own intellectual property, but I'm not going to go there tonight. It has also produced the awareness of the need to address the problems of Indigenous peoples through policies, laws, and budgets. Welfare doesn't seem to help Indigenous peoples because we are not part of the discussion or the decision-making process. And moving towards a declaration that states our rights would be something that would address this. Since 1945, there have been several movements, not several, I should say a few, a handful of movements that have changed almost the course of history in international law and in the international community. The movement on the decolonization of colonized countries, human rights, the women's movement, and very much so the Indigenous peoples movement, that international movement. That movement is about empowerment of Indigenous peoples, and it's about the great vision by our leaders. The great vision included the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that this is something that we need, that we should have, that should be documented. Now, this discussion has been going on and being debated for over 20 years, 21 years to be exact. Indigenous peoples have been in direct negotiations with member states of the United Nations. The UN Human Rights Council recently, this past June, adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this is after 21 years of blood, sweat, and tears, literally. The debate had to go on under an intercessional working group on the declaration that was held in Geneva, Switzerland. So now imagine trying to put together a delegation, a group of people who are going to go to Geneva and spend 2 weeks around the clock, pretty much 16, 17-hour days, debating with member nations on things such as the right to self-determination, things such as collective rights and group rights, and then doing all of the legal arguments. It has been a tremendous experience. I mean, I feel privileged by participating in it. It certainly has strengthened the Indigenous movement. It has created a dialogue and partnership with member states, and it has forged cooperation within the UN system. All right? Absolutely a good thing. Now let me share with you some of the emphasis of rights that this declaration addresses. It talks about and it documents the rights of Indigenous peoples to maintain and strengthen our own institutions, to strengthen our own cultures, to strengthen our own traditions, and to pursue our development in keeping with our own needs and aspirations. That is another example of the right to self-determination, all those expressions. The Declaration addresses, as I said earlier, both individual and collective human rights and recognizes our right to self-determination, which basically means, which my colleague spoke to earlier, that we as Indigenous peoples can freely determine our political status and pursue our own economic, cultural and social development, that those decisions are ours to be made internally. The Declaration also goes on to recognize our subsistence rights, that when our hunting rights and our fishing rights are violated, that we have the right to redress and to go after whoever is trying to take away those rights. That we have that right to free, prior, and informed consent. That maybe Allied Chemical wouldn't have dumped its toxic waste in Onondaga Lake so many years ago if there were a declaration protecting Indigenous rights at that time. Now, as you know, Honeywell bought and took over Allied Chemical. They hold their annual shareholders meeting in New Jersey every year in April. Those of you who are with institutions who have any kind of holdings, any kind of stock in Honeywell, I would strongly advise you to try to attend the shareholders meeting and also be put on the agenda to talk about Honeywell's responsibility for cleaning up our sacred site. Not for a few $1 million, but at several $billion. Not to seal the bottom and hope for the best. No. Essentially, this Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples outlaws discrimination against Indigenous peoples. But you need to know that this declaration is not a convention. It's not legally binding, but it represents a really dynamic development of legal norms and human rights for Indigenous peoples. But let me tell you where the Declaration is right now, all right, within the UN process. I shared with you that the Declaration was adopted and approved by the Human Rights Council in June. The Council sent the Declaration as a resolution off to the third committee of the General Assembly. The third committee is responsible for looking at anything that has to do with human rights. The process and protocol of that committee is that they approve it and then send it off to the General Assembly, where 191 nations will either vote or adopt the Declaration by consensus. Well, it's sitting in the third committee. Tomorrow morning, there's a possibility that the Declaration could be on the road to nowhere. What has happened, unfortunately, because of 4 countries who have been working very vigorously and lobbying against the Declaration, against approval of it, and the gang of 4 that I'm referring to are the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand all have Indigenous peoples and all have treaties with Indigenous peoples. The United States and Canada has the strongest treaties with any Indigenous nations of any place in the world. Okay. They have spent the past 21 years putting up all these fences and creating all these landmines for Indigenous folks who've been working really hard to try to find a resolution and an agreement that Indigenous peoples and nation states can come to, hopefully by consensus, so that we will have this draft. Even though our argument that this is not a convention It is not legally binding, that it is an aspiration of what Indigenous peoples and relations with nation states is going to create. These legal arguments that we have been making for 20 years, mostly with those 4 countries, once we finished one argument, they'd come forward with another legal argument. We'd finish that, and they'd come forward with another. Now, during that process, unfortunately, something happened. Indigenous peoples were ignoring the African countries, the African group. The African group is very solidly aligned, as are the Asian group of countries. And what happened about a week ago was the country of Namibia put forward a resolution in the Third Committee saying that they would like to postpone any movement on the declaration. The sponsors of that resolution are Botswana and Nigeria. Now, Botswana has minerals, it has diamond mines, some of them owned by Canada, and I don't need to go on as to like connecting the dots for you. But certainly the Kansas group of states, which is how they're referred to, is working behind the scenes. Well, because the African group of countries always vote to